There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space, and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition. It lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Dimensions, a Twilight Zone podcast. I'm your host, Bill Couch. On tonight's episode, we will be discussing Season 1, Episode 18, titled The Last Flight. It was written by Richard Matheson, directed by William F. Claxton, produced by Buck Houghton, music by Bernard Herrmann, and in the cast were Kenneth Hay, Alexander Scarby, Simon Scott, and Robert Warwick. The air date for this episode was February 5th, 1960, and you can watch this episode on Paramount Plus, Pluto TV, or the DVDs and Blu-rays if you should have them. And if you don't, I recommend making a purchase, because it's worth it. And now for the opening narration. Witness Flight Lieutenant William Terence Decker, Royal Flying Corps, returning from a patrol somewhere over France. The year is 1917. The problem is that the lieutenant is hopelessly lost. Lieutenant Decker will soon discover that a man can be lost not only in terms of maps and miles, but also in time. And time, in this case, can be measured in eternities. In any good story, you have to have a hook that holds the audience and a payoff or closure to the conflict of the story, which usually revolves directly around the hook. And you get that in this story. Wonderfully written by Richard Matheson and brought to the screen by Serling and William F. Claxton. This episode delivers exactly on what it promises. We start with Terry Becker, who descends out of a cloud and lands at the Reims Air Force Base in France, where he is piloting a plane from the World War I era. He, of course, is stopped by the military personnel and brought in for questioning. Among the questioning, or during the questioning, we find out that even though it's modern day, in our case, 1959, Terence Decker believes that it is in fact March 5th of 1917. Now, it's currently March 5th of 2023 when I'm recording this episode. Inadvertently, I might add, so that all kind of works together serendipitously. But Decker, through the questioning and through seeing all the modern planes and everything else, realizes that it is in fact 1959. And he mentions the name Alexander McKay. Now, McKay is now an Air Vice Marshal who is also on the way to the base for an inspection. Becker says he and McKay used to fly in World War I, and McKay was killed right before Decker went through time. So we get kind of a backstory on Decker being, basically seeing his friend get killed that he flew with right before he got transported to 1959. So Major General Harper and Lieutenant Wilson, who who are questioning him, of course, think that he is a little bit off his rocker. More so Major General than the lieutenant. The Lieutenant Wilson is kind of starting to believe Decker and thinking that he might actually be onto something. But they want to wait till Vice Marshal McKay comes in so that he can either confirm or deny that Decker is who he says he is. So they hold Decker in another room behind a guarded door. They look through his personal effects, and this still doesn't sway Major General Harper, but it does sway Lieutenant Wilson into believing that Decker is who he says he is. So Lieutenant Wilson goes to talk to Decker, and in their chat, it seems that Decker is rather apprehensive to see McKay. We learn through some back and forth with the lieutenant that Decker calls McKay Old Lead Bottom because when they were flying over enemy lines, a German had shot McKay in a very private and unfortunate place, and that garnered him the nickname of Lead Bottom by Decker. Wilson again reiterates that McKay didn't die in World War I, and as a matter of fact, he went on to be quite a hero during World War II in the Blitz, saving, as he says, untold thousands of lives with his bravery and his ability to fly a plane. It's at this point that Decker is at his most panicked, and he explains to Wilson that McKay couldn't be alive because when he went into the cloud, McKay was surrounded by 7 German planes, and there's no way he could have made it out alive. Even with his help, he doesn't think that he would have made it out alive. And then he goes on to tell Lieutenant Wilson about how he was actually running away from the fight, and that he had no other, he originally said he had 3 German planes coming down on him, and come to find out that wasn't true. He actually had no one on him, and that he was just leaving the fight because he was afraid and wanted to run away. And he goes on this long, very heartfelt, basically soliloquy about how he was always a coward. He was always the one to run away from a fight and never face a fight. And it didn't change when he became a fighter pilot either. Matter of fact, it sort of almost got a little worse because, of the situations he was being put in. And that he had thought several times about just landing his plane behind enemy lines and, throwing up the white flag and surrendering, since, pilots got treated better as prisoners of war than just regular infantrymen or paratroopers or anything like that. And, but then he thought, if anyone found out, he couldn't live with the shame of what he had done. And so he was stuck being not the person he wanted to be, but not the person he could have been, who you could argue would be quite worse. But this is where the lieutenant tells him again that, McKay didn't die in the fight. He must have survived. And, that he's on his way there, so he must have survived the fight that Decker ran away from, because he's coming to the base to do an inspection. So obviously he lived. And, he must have had some help from somewhere. And Decker said, well, there was no one within 15 miles of us. There was no one that could have helped him except me, and I ran away. And then he had a thought of, well, what if he didn't run away? What if he went back to see if he could help his friend? And so at that point, he decided he had to escape and get back to his plane. So he proceeds to knock out Lieutenant Wilson and incapacitate the guard at the door and run away into the airfield to get to his plane and start his plane. And he's about to get into it when, he has to knock out a field attendant, and then Lieutenant Wilson makes it out there and puts his gun on him and says, you need to turn your engine off now. And Decker's like, no, I'm going back. He said, shoot if you want to. He said, I'd rather die. And Lieutenant Wilson stands down and lets him take his plane and fly back into the clouds to go help old Leadbottom McKay. And so he does. The plane disappears into the clouds, never to be seen in 1959 again. It's at this point that McKay shows up and is greeted by Harper and Wilson, who go on to ask him about if he knew a man named William Terrence Decker, who McKay immediately says, oh, Terry Decker? Yes, I flew with him during World War I. And so they go on to ask him if, what happened to him. And McKay went on to tell the story about how they were out on patrol and got surrounded by German fighter pilots, and Decker lit out and was going to run away, and before you know it, McKay says he turns around and here comes Decker diving headfirst into the fight, guns blazing, and takes out a good number of the planes before they take him out and kill him. And McKay was able to escape and get away because of Decker's bravery in combat. So Major General Harper says, well, the Germans would usually return the personal effects of the downed fighter pilots, wouldn't they? And McKay said yes. And Harper said, did they ever return Decker's? And McKay said, no, they didn't. And so they show him Decker's personal effects that he still left behind when he was being interrogated and before he ran away and got into his plane. And McKay is just shy of flabbergasted at how they had it. And he asked for an explanation on why they had Decker's personal effects, and then Wilson says, well, I think you better sit down, old Leadbottom, so that they could tell him the story. And that makes the end of the episode. And now for the closing narration. Dialogue from a play, Hamlet to Horatio. There are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy. Dialogue from a play, written long before men took to the sky. There are more things in heaven and earth, and in the sky, than perhaps can be dreamt of, and somewhere in between the heaven, the sky, and the earth lies the Twilight Zone. Now, I like this episode. To me, it's top middle tier of episodes. It's one of those ones that's kind of a sleeper episode. You don't really expect it to be as good as it is, but upon repeated viewings, it just makes more and more sense and gets better and better the more times you see it. It's one of those episodes that never really make it to anybody's top 10 list, but it's definitely a well executed and quite well done, well acted piece of fiction for a television series from 70 years ago. Like I said, it's not my favorite. It's not even in my top 10, but it's one of those ones that, if I sit down and it's on, I'm not going to get up and go into the other room and make a snack before I come back and watch whatever the next episode's going to be. I'll sit and watch this one because it's just compelling enough to make a really good Twilight Zone. But there's something about it that's just not quite complete or not quite. It's a great story. It's a great idea. It's acted well. It's directed fine, but just something about it doesn't quite ring all the bells of a top tier Twilight Zone, which is to say it's not a bad episode. It just isn't as good as several others. But it's nowhere near the bottom of the list of anyone's list that I've ever seen. Nor should it be, because it's a wonderful episode. And I think, like I said, it's slept on by a lot of people. I think a lot of people, it gets flown over. If you're talking about the TV show as a whole, it's one of those episodes that gets overlooked a lot of times, and it really shouldn't be, because it's actually a quite well done episode. So let's move on to the biographies of the people that made it and the people that were in it. So William F. Claxton was the director. He was born in 1914 and died in 1996. He has 66 credits on his IMDb, including 4 Twilight Zone episodes, 1 this season and 3 in season 3. One of those episodes being I Sing the Body Electric, which was the only Twilight Zone written or put to the screen based on a story by Ray Bradbury. And we can get more into that when it comes to that episode, because it's a whole story between Serling and Bradbury, and it's quite interesting. So stay tuned till season 3 to hear about that. He started out his career directing movies. Half Past Midnight was his very first feature that he directed. And then when TV became the new and flashy medium, he moved mostly to TV, where he directed episodes of shows like The Schlitz Playhouse, The Californians, Rawhide, Perry Mason, and Bonanza. And he died in 1996. So we will move on now to Kenneth Hay, who played Decker. He was born in 1931 and died just not too long ago in 2018. He had 88 credits to his name on IMDb. He was a British stage star who made his name from his portrayal in the stage play Look Back in Anger. He sort of traveled between America and England, where he was on the stage and the screen. He was on Broadway, and he was also working in TV and movies. He did shows like Playhouse 90, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Thriller, Man at the Top, who he also did the movie version of Man at the Top, starred in it, and One Life to Live. Sadly, in 2003, He was dining at a restaurant where he got choked on a bone, and he survived, but the lack of oxygen caused brain damage to where he had to live out the remaining 15 years of his life in a nursing home, and he passed away in 2018. So kind of a sad ending to a life of a man that was quite talented and quite respected on the stage and at least the small screen, if not the big screen. Next on our list is Alexander Skirby, who played Major General Harper. He was born in 1913 and died in 1985. He had 88 credits to his name on IMDb. He started out on the stage and then moved to radio when it was discovered that he had quite a voice on him, and he actually started at this time, between his stage and starting to really get into radio, he lent his powerful instrument of a voice to recording audiobooks for the blind. He did over 500 books that he narrated for the blind, so that the blind could basically, back in the day, it isn't like Audible is now or any of those, where anyone can have an audiobook. Back then, it wasn't nearly like it is today, and for him to narrate and read and record over 500 books in his life to help out this organization that did that is quite wonderful, and very, 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 very cool. I always thought that would be something I would like to do, maybe narrate an audiobook or get into some sort of doing radio dramas, something like that. I always thought that would be wonderful and a really, really good thing to do. I've always been fascinated by radio and radio programs, especially the old radio programs, and I've always just had a fascination with them, and I always thought it would be really cool to get into that. But I digress, because this isn't about me. This is about Alexander Skirby. So doing the audiobooks also led him into radio, where he stayed until TV and that started to get big again. One of his bigger roles was in the movie Gilda with Rita Hayworth, which, if you know anything about the Shawshank Redemption, if you've ever seen that movie, that was the movie that the inmates were watching, that Andy Dufresne got the picture of for the wall of his cell from Red. That was Rita Hayworth, and that was from the movie Gilda that Alexander Skirby was in. He also was in John Ford's epic Giant, and also in Disney's The Shaggy Dog from back in the day. He also did episodes of television shows such as the one episode of The Twilight Zone, like we saw here, The Rifleman, Rawhide, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and Mannix, among others. And he passed away in 1985. Now, the character of Wilson was played by Simon Scott, who was born in 1920 and passed away in 1991. He had 144 IMDb credits to his name. During World War II, he served in the Navy, and he was basically, when he got out of the Navy, he got into acting, where he turned into quite the character actor in movies and in television. He was in TV shows like Suspicion, Wagon Train, Peter Gunn, 77 Sunset Strip, The Alfred Hitchcock Hour, Wild Wild West, and The Mod Squad. And he passed away from a heart attack in 1991. And lastly but not leastly is Mr. Robert Warwick, who played Old Leadbottom McKay. He was born in 1878 and passed away in 1964, and he garnered 252 IMDb credits to his name in that amount of time. He was a stage actor to begin with, who then broke into the silent films, where he became quite the star of the silent movies, and was in all the regular TV shows of the day when TV became a medium. He was in things like Dr. Kildare, Wagon Train, and Maverick. And he died not too long after this episode, about four years after, in 1964, after an extended illness. So let's move into trivia of this episode. Not a whole lot of trivia in this episode. Again, it's one of those ones that not a lot of people look into, so there's not a whole lot written about it. It was filmed at Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino, which now is no longer a military base. That's now the site of the San Bernardino International Airport. The rank of Air Vice Marshal, which Old Leadbottom was, is the RAF equivalent to Major General of the USAF. Therefore, McKay and Harper in this episode would be contemporaries. And this episode, another piece of trivia, recycled some of the music from the pilot episode, Where Is Everybody?, in this episode. Now, for the goofs. Reams Air Force Base wasn't an American base at the time that Decker was flying in 1917, because he was flying in March of 1917 when he went, to the future, where the United States didn't declare war or get itself part into the war until April of 1917. So we weren't even in the war until a month after Decker flew into the clouds and to the future. And then the only real other goof of this episode, and it's more of just a it's not a continuity error, I don't know what you'd call it, but the hand salute wouldn't be appropriate for anyone other than the Major General. The anyone else lower in rank would just stand at attention when a superior officer or someone who is a superior officer like McKay would come into the room. A hand salute would not be appropriate at that time. Standing at attention would be the appropriate response at the time. So let's move on to likes and dislikes of this episode. I like the story. I like the acting. The direction was fine. It was a good episode. My only dislike of the episode is that it just is it's just a plain episode. I don't know how to explain it. Like, you kind of already know when, it's, I don't want to say predictable necessarily, but you already know that Decker's going to try to get out of there and go back to the future to help his friend, and, all this stuff. You already know that's probably going to happen. You're just not quite sure how. And beyond that, the rest of it is just whether they believe him or not, which in the scheme of things doesn't really matter. And in that same note, it wouldn't be like you could have him and Leadbottom meet each other, because if he never went back to the future, Lead Bottom wouldn't exist. So they kind of painted themselves into a paradox at that sort of situation in this episode. So halfway through the episode, you already know, well, Deckard's going to go back to the future and he's going to save everything, and then McKay's going to land and everybody's going to know that he's still alive because Deckard came back from the past to the future to save him when he was surrounded by all the German planes after Deckard lit out on him and tried to run away from the fight. So my only complaint was it's just an average episode. And if that's my worst complaint about this episode, then that's nowhere near as bad as some of the other episodes are that are more of the bottom tier, which is why that puts this one at least in the middle tier, if not the middle top tier of Twilight Zone episodes. Because while it is predictable, it's also kind of fun to watch because the acting is actually pretty well done in this episode. So you kind of can overlook a few things, like knowing what's going to happen. But again, if you're a Twilight Zone fan, you've seen every episode probably multiple times. You already know what's going to happen in The Monsters on Maple Street. You already know what's going to happen in The Fever. You already know what's going to happen in Perchance to Dream or Time Enough at Last. You already know what's going to happen, but you watch it anyway because it's like comfort food for your brain, which is why, at least part of the reason why, it's still quite a beloved television show to this day, and it resonates with so many people, is the fact that there's a huge suitcase full of nostalgia that comes along with most episodes of this television show, and whether people want to admit it or not, they love it because of that. And it's actually quite a comforting feeling. You know, like I said, it's comfort food for the brain. Now, if I were to get a call from Hollywood, the entity of Hollywood, and they said, "Bill, we're gonna remake this episode, and who do you think we should cast in the lead roles of the episode, of the characters for the episode?" And I would say, "Well, Hollywood, here's how I would cast it if you were to ask me. For the character of Deckard, I would cast Matthew Rhys, who is a Welsh-born actor, and if you ever saw the television show The Americans, he played the main character, married to Carrie Russell, and they were the Russian spies that were living in America under assumed names with American accents and that sort of thing. But Matthew Rhys would be my choice for Deckard. For Harper, I would go with Timothy Hutton, because why not? He's a good actor. It's a nice little role for him, and I think he'd do good in it. For Wilson, I would go with Noah Emmerich, who, if you, again, have ever watched The Americans, he played Matthew Rhys's next-door neighbor, who also worked for the government. So, if you haven't seen that show, by the way, watch that show. It was well done show. But Noah Emmerich is who I would cast as Wilson. And then for Vice Marshal McKay, I would go big actor in a small role. I would cast Sir Patrick Stewart in the role. Because why not? Patrick Stewart needs to be in more things. He's a fantastic actor, and that would just be cool seeing him in that little part, just eating the place alive. But as always, let me know what you think. Who would you cast in the if they were to remake this episode today? who would you cast as the lead actors? Let me know at dimensionszpodcast.com. Just write me an email. Let me know who you would cast. I'd love to hear from you. Now, for the moral or philosophy of this episode, obviously this episode is strongly about facing your fears and doing the right thing. I will say that running away from your fears or your problems might solve an immediate want or an immediate need, but the monkey that would be on your back that would be called regret is far worse than, any momentary good feeling you get from running away from something, So, unlike this story, a lot of times you don't get a second chance to be brave or do the right thing. So, I think what we should learn from this is that, this episode is all about doing the right thing and being brave in the face of adversity. And doing the right thing might not always be easy, but it is always the best path to take in any situation. So the clock on the wall is telling me it's time to go. No listener feedback this week, but I do welcome any and all listener feedback. All 12 of you out there that are listening to me, if you want to write me an email, just email me at dimensionszpodcast. That's dimensionszpodcast @gmail.com, and tell me what you think. Tell me what you think about this episode, past episodes, future episodes, what you think of the series as a whole. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So let me have them. So that will be the end of this episode. Stay tuned for next week's episode, where a man sees the light and knows who is going to be going towards the light. So join us next week for a military-themed episode titled The Purple Testament. Thank you, and good night, everybody.